Hi, my name is Jessica. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about adopting a process-oriented perspective. Let's start with an example of one type of natural riverscape, a beaver-mediated headwater stream in Gunnison County. These are the types of places where we at EcoMetrics spend most of our field seasons. While restorations efforts fill a lot of our time, today I want to focus not on the tools of restoration, but something much more important, and that is the thinking behind it. Through our experience as restoration practitioners and applied scientists, we've become convinced that more important than any single project or any particular structure is the perspective behind these efforts. Restoration of natural riverscapes means giving control back to nature, and this requires adopting a process-oriented perspective. Adopting a new perspective is challenging, and thinking about how language influences expectation can help with this mental shift. We can look back at the history of riverwork to help us understand why we use the common language we do today. We can consider how this history influences our understanding and expectations of waterways and of restoration. Then we can consider what language will help us communicate expectations of process-based restoration. This slide is from Dr. Brad Johnson, who gave us a history lesson at last year's Sustaining Colorado Watersheds Conference. He said that early river manipulations were based on a need to manage and control riverscapes. The purpose was to make sure land could be developed, that cities wouldn't get flooded or bridges blown out. George Washington was a surveyor and appointed the first engineer officers of the Army. It was the job of these early engineers to design, build, and maintain river channels that met these criteria. The development of stream science followed this line of reasoning, creating tools and approaches to support these efforts. At this time in history, ecological function was not part of the equation. From this perspective, river work was an attempt to control natural dynamic processes, not restore them. This summary is supported by Dr. Ellen Wool and co-authors, writing that early river work was concerned with enhancing navigation and reducing the risk of loss of life and property. They noted that it was under this management paradigm, river corridors were extensively modified, typically with the cumulative effect of creating more uniform, physically simplified, and ecologically less diverse and functional river corridors. Then they tell us that there was a shift around the end of the 20th century with an emergence of river manipulation for aesthetic and recreational purposes. With this shift, natural functions start to become incorporated in river work. But this is still designing, building, and maintaining a modified system. Even though it includes the added benefit of recreation, this is still a river through a town that we don't want to flood. I want to take a minute to say thank you to all the engineers. This is my hometown of Breckenridge along the Blue River, where engineers did an amazing job of resurrecting the river from past impacts of dredge mining to create recreation and enhance habitat in the way that protects our town from flooding. Over the last 200 plus years, we've been referring to river work with the design, build, maintain words. Within these words are expectations of the past that have largely consisted of controlling natural processes to make waterways meet our human-based criteria. So what happens when the intent of river work becomes restoring a natural stream? If we want to restore simplified riverscapes back to something that looks like this, we're not designing something novel to meet human needs, but re-enabling something ancient. Complexity at this scale is not built. There are no engineered plans that capture the intricacies and interactions that happen on this type of riverscape. In fact, we couldn't build this riverscape if we tried, even with endless specialists. Complexity at this scale can only evolve. These systems do not maintain any particular feature in any specific location. Instead, they're changing over time, responding to the changing world around them. Dr. Colin Thorne refers to these systems as kaleidoscope streams because all the parts and pieces are constantly shifting and morphing shape. So this is a little bit awkward. The words that we've been using don't really fit these situations. These situations are different. They differ in goals, approach, techniques, and expectations. They differ in mindset and perspective. Trying to fit process-based restoration into the design-build mentality doesn't help anyone. In fact, it's quite confusing. What if we change our language and start using words that prompt a cognitive paradigm that reflect the desired outcome? Rather than discussing restoration as a design, build, maintain exercise, we can look at it as diagnosing the causes of impairment, prescribing treatments, and following up with ongoing care to manage health of the system. Changing our mindset from a design build mentality to a healing mentality and using the words that reflect that will help us communicate. These terms are borrowed from another familiar health framework, our human health. This is the language we know that applies to complex systems like rivers and humans when describing health. How we employ this mindset in practice is something we've been working on for 20 years. Rather than design a stream to meet specific objectives, we diagnose it to identify the anthropogenic impacts that disrupt natural processes. Like a medical diagnosis, we use detailed history and physical examination to target the root causes of impairment and decide which can be corrected or mitigated to relieve stress. The purpose of treatments is to relieve anthropogenic stress or assist recovery after a stressor is removed. Treatments can be interventions analogous to surgery, which can sometimes involve physical manipulations or structures. Or they can be therapies, more passive approaches that guide healing with a lighter touch. Unlike building, treatment isn't the end, it's a means to an end. Treatments enable and accelerate the natural healing processes. Rather than maintain the things we build, we should expect change. Ongoing care is the continued support during the healing process. Most of our waterways have been dramatically altered and now exist amid constant and increasing anthropogenic stress. We should expect healing to take time and likely require an iterative approach. The design build language we use implies immediate static results. This view has to change if we expect restoration to achieve the guiding image of a dynamic, healthy ecosystem that functions by natural processes. At this point in the presentation, you might be wondering why you're getting a language lesson from an ecologist. And you're exactly right. This is not my field of expertise. So I reached out to a linguist to get their opinion. I described the situation and asked, does the language we use influence our expectation? The answer I got was a resounding yes. A common adage in the linguistic world is that language is culture and culture is language. This means that the language you use reflects your values and beliefs. Linguistic relativity is an established field of linguistics and was pioneered by Benjamin Lee Whorf. His hypothesis was that language influences thought, shaping the way we think and even what we can think about. Mr. Whorf has an interesting backstory. Before he pioneered the field of linguistic relativity, he was an insurance adjuster. While investigating recurring fires at a chemical plant, he observed people throwing cigarette butts into chemical barrels that were marked as empty, even though they were full of old fumes and residual chemicals. This was the obvious cause of the fire. But it's this observation that made Whorf realize that our concepts of reality are dependent on the language we use to describe the world around us. So what language should we use to describe our world? Are there instances where we are mislabeling barrels? The words design, build, and maintain invite a cognitive paradigm of construction, which is both durable and often disruptive to the natural landscape. Some modern building technologies may consider environmental dynamics, but generally buildings and structures and other public works are designed to defy nature and resist change. This is the appropriate language if you're restoring a house. The words diagnose, treat, care recognize the health of a system and the basic processes of life, including organization, metabolism, responsiveness, movements, and reproduction. We can take this further and think about growth, differentiation, evolution. This is the appropriate language for process-based restoration. We see our two examples after initial efforts. The restored house looks fresh and new and will need continued maintenance as expected. A house cannot be process-based restored. It must be designed, built, and maintained. What will happen to the stream after the initial treatments? Well, we don't really know. If we're lucky, beavers may reoccupy the site and take over the job of ongoing care. They may not, and humans will need to continue to mimic the influence of beavers. We need to be ready for either scenario, observe the response of the system to treatments, and adjust care as needed. The amazing piece is that as health improves and more natural processes resume, the stream has potential to become self-sustaining. A beaver wetland is an amazing example of a natural ecosystem that sustains itself. It's an ecological machine, and as long as all the parts are there, it functions totally on its own, keeping the wetland ecosystem dynamic, complex, and functioning. If natural processes can be restored at a meaningful scale, these systems can sustain their own health. And that is a very valuable trait. As Omerod tells us, this is more important than ever because restoration endpoints are moving targets in an ever-changing world. These are the core principles of process-based restoration, and they probably look quite familiar to many people these days. But as Mark Beardsley articulated recently, this concept is still difficult to get your head around, at least in the practical sense of what you actually do when you set out to restore a degraded riverscape. And that's because process-based implies a mindset through which we understand and approach riverscape restoration, not a specific action or protocol. I think the words diagnose, treat, care can help bring a practical angle to this concept. Diagnosing cause of impairment focuses us on the root cause of degradation. Treatments should address these causes and be consistent with site potential to enable recovery at a scale that can be sustained. Depending on the response of the system, care focuses us on the next steps of the recovery process. But it is this last principle where I think these words can be most meaningful. Together, diagnose, treat, care imply the expectation of ecosystem dynamics. Clear communication of desired outcomes of restoration efforts may be the most valuable piece of this entire puzzle. By changing our language, we can communicate expectations and be explicit that what we are really doing with restoration is diagnosing, treating, and caring for natural ecosystems, not designing, building, and maintaining them. As Mark puts it, process-based restoration principles are sound, so our success will come down to how well we put them into practice. Adopting a process-oriented perspective and using the language that supports this mindset will help us get there.